April 26, 1986, 1:23 a.m. Technicians in the control room at Chernobyl nuclear power plant sit at their stations. The concrete room is cool, the air damp. Initiating safety test now, one of the operators says. The fuel rods begin to shift in nuclear reactor unit 4. Suddenly, there is a power surge in the core. A siren begins to blare in the control room. Red lights flash, casting a blood-red glow across the faces of the men in the chamber. An uncontrollable chain reaction is initiated in the nuclear reactor. One of the operators sprints over to a control panel and slams his fist against the emergency shutdown button. The control rods jam as they proceed toward the core. 54 seconds after the test is initiated, there is an explosion. In 1977, Soviet engineers and workers constructed 4 RBMK nuclear reactors at the site that would become the Vladimir Ilyich Lenin nuclear power plant. After the disaster, this facility would simply be known as the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. By the following year, one of the reactors would be brought online, and in 1984, the plant would have 4 active reactors, with a 5th under construction. Each of the reactors was capable of producing around 1,000 megawatts of electric power. Chernobyl sits just south of the Belarus border in Ukraine and is about 65 miles or 104 kilometers north of Kyiv. On April 25, 1986, at 1 in the morning, the operators at Chernobyl reduced the power being sent to reactor number 4 as they prepared to run a safety test on the system. This was done at the same time that routine maintenance was being carried out. The test itself would determine if the still spinning turbines of the reactor could continue to produce enough electricity to keep the coolant pumps operating if there was ever a complete loss of power at the plant. This information needed to be ascertained in order to surmise whether the gap between a power loss and the time it took for the emergency generators to kick in would result in a nuclear meltdown or catastrophic failure. At 2 p.m. that day, the cooling system was disabled, so the test could be run without any interference. The tampering with the coolant system was not disclosed to some of the incoming operators during the shift change, which would have been information needed in the moments before the core went critical. As the day progressed, the test was pushed further and further back to make sure it did not interfere with the power needs of the surrounding towns. Reactor 4's power levels were kept around 1,600 megawatts while the team waited for the appropriate time to start the experiment. At 11:10 p.m., operators at Chernobyl received word that they could continue the experiment. However, the shift change was about to happen, so rather than starting the test in the middle of a shift change, the shutdown was delayed once again. At midnight, the new shift came in. They were less experienced and had not been properly briefed or trained on what should be done during the test. This would lead to catastrophic mistakes in the hours to come. Just after midnight, the power of reactor number 4 was lowered to 720 megawatts. The reactor was not designed to go below 700 megawatts for a sustained period of time. But for some reason, most likely due to poor oversight and training, the night shift operators at Chernobyl were unaware of this safety measure. At 12:28 a.m. on April 26, the reactor reached 500 megawatts. The local control system switched over to the automatic regulating system as energy output became dangerously low. In order to remedy the situation, the operators scrambled to remove many of the control rods in the reactor, which directly violated the safety guidelines at the power plant. This decision did not have the desired effect. A buildup of xenon on the core caused the power levels to drop even further. Either due to human error or a malfunction in the system, the reactor's output fell to 30 megawatts. By 1 a.m., the team had managed to raise the power output of the reactor number 4 to 200 megawatts. This was still below prescribed levels, but it seemed as if the core had stabilized for the moment. The deputy chief engineer and acting supervisor at Chernobyl, Anatoly Stepanovich Dyatlov, decided that the test could recommence. In preparation for what was to come, he ordered the automatic emergency shutdown system and power regulating system to be turned off. Water flow was increased to the core while additional cooling pumps were activated. This decreased the heat in the system and led to low reactivity, which necessitated the need to remove more control rods so the reactor could continue to run at 7% power for the next several minutes. Due to a buildup of pressure in a steam drum, the order was given to increase feed water flow into the core. This further reduced the number of nuclear reactions occurring in the system and caused automated safety measures to kick in and remove several more control rods. The operators and engineers conducting the experiment continually ran into pressure and reactivity issues for several more minutes. However, around 1:23 a.m., all systems seemed to finally stabilize. Dyatlov ordered the commencement of the test. At 1:23 a.m., reactor number 4 began to run as planned. This process would take about 30 seconds. At 1:23 a.m., pressure began to build in the core once again. A series of warning lights started to flash. One of the operators initiated an emergency shutdown, but several control rods jammed as they entered the core. An out-of-control chain reaction began in the reactor. At 1:23 a.m. on April 26, 1986, the chain reaction reached critical levels, and there was an explosion in reactor number 4. This was immediately followed by a second explosion that blew the 1,000-ton roof off the structure and shot a fireball into the sky, briefly illuminating the surrounding area as if it were the middle of the day. The explosion in reactor number 4 caused a massive disruption in energy output. Power fluctuated throughout the power plant. The explosion ejected hundreds of tons of irradiated dust into the air as chunks of radioactive graphite hurtled across the area. Radiation began to spew out of the exposed reactor like smoke rising from a volcano. The entire complex rocked from the explosions, but the operators in the control center continued to operate as if reactor number 4 was still intact. Several engineers insisted that there had been a catastrophic failure and that all evidence pointed to a partial meltdown in the core. However, the initial reaction of Anatoly Dyatlov was to continue operating the nuclear power plant as if nothing was wrong, even though one of the reactors had just exploded and was releasing radiation and debris into the atmosphere. This led to slow response times from the personnel working in the control room, while emergency crews who could see the explosion from miles away began rushing to the Chernobyl nuclear power plant to get the flames under control. At least 28 people were killed in the initial explosion, and 100 more were seriously injured out of the 600 workers present at the power plant that night. 134 of them, including the operators running the test gone wrong, received between 0.8 and 16 grays of radiation, or about 80 to 1,600 rads. This high dose of radiation resulted in all of them developing radiation sickness soon after the accident. 28 died within 3 months of the reactor exploding. At 1:28 a.m., the first firefighters arrived at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. The facility was being consumed by several fires raging across the complex. Other than personnel trying to escape the flames, these firefighters were the first people exposed to the lethal doses of radiation pouring out of the exposed reactor after the initial explosion. They had not been warned of the dangers they were walking into. The firefighters did not wear any protective clothing, nor take any precautions to mitigate their exposure to radiation as they rushed into the nuclear power plant, trying to save as many lives as they could. At 2:15 a.m., almost an hour after the reactor blew up, local Soviet officials were briefed on the compromised nuclear power plant. They decided to set up roadblocks along the main entry points into and out of the nearby city of Pripyat, which had been built to house the Chernobyl workers and their families. Even though the local officials knew that a catastrophic event had happened, they were not given information on the extent of the damage, the danger the exposed core presented, or that the population in the surrounding area should be evacuated. Therefore, all personnel assisting with the roadblocks, including police and military officers, had not been warned about the true extent of the dangers the power plant posed. Like the firefighters who were on the front lines, these first responders proceeded closer to the Chernobyl power plant without any protective gear. For the remainder of the night into the early morning, emergency personnel continued to provide any form of aid they could, exposing themselves to high doses of radiation. The fire in reactor number 4 continued to rage. In order to increase safety measures and to make sure no further reactor failures occurred, officials ordered that reactor number 3 be shut down at 5 a.m. and reactors 1 and 2 be shut down a few hours later. However, all 3 remaining reactors would be reopened in the coming months, even as the true nature of the disaster was discovered by the rest of the world. The last of the fires that had spread through the complex were finally extinguished at 6:35 a.m. However, the inferno burning in the core of reactor 4 was unreachable without emergency personnel receiving deadly doses of radiation. Emergency personnel had already been in the building to put out fires and rescue any survivors, and anyone who stepped foot near the exposed reactor core would die of radiation poisoning in the coming months. This posed a significant problem for Soviet leadership. Nuclear engineers and scientists from across the Soviet Union who were consulted about the Chernobyl disaster warned the leadership that as long as the core was exposed and the fire continued to burn in its core, more and more radioactive material would be spewed into the air and sweep across the region. The Soviet Union wanted to keep the extent of the Chernobyl disaster quiet for as long as possible, and therefore suppressed information going into and coming out of the area. However, they needed to get the fire in the core under control, or eventually the radiation levels would be so high that there would be no hiding what had happened. At 10 a.m. on April 27th, the Soviets began flying transport helicopters loaded with sand, boron, lead, and dolomite over the exposed core of reactor number 4. These substances were dropped into the core to suppress the fire and contain some of the radiation. The residents in and around Chernobyl continued to be left in the dark about what was happening at the nuclear power plant. Emergency personnel who had been at the plant and returned home informed their loved ones of how bad things were. The tragic part was that these men didn't just bring home stories. Since no one was ordered to wear protective gear, anyone who was at the power plant was covered in radiation, which they brought home with them, exposing their family and loved ones to the deadly particles that clung to their clothes, skin, and hair. At 2 p.m. on April 27, 36 hours after the explosion at the nuclear power plant, Soviet officials began evacuating people from the area. They had known how deadly the spreading radiation was long before they ordered the evacuations, but the main priority of the Soviet leadership was to contain the situation first and worry about their people later. The delayed evacuation undoubtedly led to countless unnecessary deaths and illnesses as a direct result of prolonged exposure to radiation. 115,000 people were evacuated from Pripyat or nearby towns on April 27th. The government continued to lie and withhold information from everyone who was in danger at the time, along with the rest of the world. The residents who had been evacuated were told it would only be temporary and they would be returning to their homes in the near future. This was a lie, and the Soviet leadership knew it. Nuclear experts had already informed them that the Chernobyl power plant and the surrounding region would remain irradiated for years to come. Even still, residents were told to only grab important documents and belongings, along with any food they could carry. Only days later, an exclusion zone was set up around Chernobyl. It extended 18.6 miles or 30 kilometers from the nuclear power plant and incorporated around 1,017 square miles or 2,634 square kilometers. However, this exclusion zone would later be expanded to include 1,600 square miles or 4,143 square kilometers to encompass several heavily irradiated areas outside the initial zone. No unauthorized personnel would be able to enter. In fact, the exclusion zone is still in place today. Anyone who was evacuated on April 27th would never see their homes again. Many would also die premature, horrible deaths as a result of radiation exposure from the meltdown at the power plant and the subsequent slow response of the Soviet government to evacuate non-essential personnel. On April 28, 1986, 2 days after the nuclear reactor at Chernobyl exploded, Swedish air monitors detected a large amount of radiation coming from the south. The source of the radiation was traced back to the USSR. It could not be determined immediately where the radiation was coming from, and the silence of the Soviet Union made the Swedes extremely suspicious. If they were detecting the radiation, it must have meant that the Soviets were aware something within their border was releasing an enormous amount of irradiated particles in the atmosphere. The Swedish government immediately contacted the Kremlin for answers. Like with everything else during the Chernobyl disaster, the Soviets were slow to respond. Eventually, they informed the Swedes that there had been an accident. They did not elaborate or provide any further relevant information, but one thing was for sure. Since the radiation levels reaching Sweden were so high, it had to mean something extremely bad was going on within the Soviet borders. The Kremlin informed the Swedish government that everything was under control when nothing could be further from the truth. The exposed core of Reactor 4 was still ejecting huge amounts of radiation into the atmosphere, and it would not stop anytime soon. The following day, U.S. spy satellites confirmed what many had feared all along. The damage that the Chernobyl power plant had sustained was much worse than the Soviets were letting on. Reactor 4 was completely exposed, and around 30% of the power plant's 190 metric tons of uranium was being ejected into the atmosphere. If the Soviets didn't get the reactor fire under control and contain the radiation leak soon, neighboring nations might be facing their own crisis in the near future. It was not clear how far the radioactive particles would drift, so other countries in the region began taking precautions. On May 4th, a new set of containment crews started to work at Chernobyl and began pumping liquid nitrogen underneath the reactor to cool it down. 800,000 workers began the arduous job of containment and cleanup around the power plant. They needed to remove any contaminated debris that had been blown off the structure as the initial explosions ripped through the facility. Entire villages near the power plant were bulldozed, and any animals present in the exclusion zone were shot on sight. This included dogs, cats, livestock, and wildlife. Any radioactive rubble or waste was buried deep underground, which included the top layer of soil. Around 4 square miles in the exclusion zone became known as the Red Forest due to the reddish-brown color the leaves of trees had turned as they died from high amounts of radiation absorbed by their cells. Further away from the nuclear power plant, where the radiation levels were slightly lower, everything looked to be just fine. But when Geiger counters were brought in, it was found that radiation covered everything, and it would only be a matter of time before living things like plants and animals would show signs of radiation poisoning. Then on May 6, the radioactive emissions being discharged from reactor number 4 decreased dramatically. This was most likely due to the fire in the core finally burning itself out, as up to this point, the Soviets were still having trouble dousing the fire in the reactor. As more and more people learned of the true extent of the disaster, the Soviet Union decided to take steps to protect its citizens. The Kremlin ordered officials in Kyiv to close schools and advised their citizens to stay inside. People were warned against consuming leafy greens and told to refrain from eating vegetables grown in the area until it could be confirmed they were free of radiation. In the future, it would be determined that the amount of radioactive particles released into the atmosphere far exceeded the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This demonstrated the danger that nuclear power plants could pose if not properly managed or without adequate safety measures in place. The radionuclides that were released from the destroyed reactor were mainly iodine-131, cesium-134, and cesium-137. Each of these radionuclides posed their own problems. Iodine-131 had a relatively short half-life of about 8 days. However, it could easily get into the human body through breathing contaminated air, consumption of leafy greens, or ingesting dairy products. If consumed this way, the iodine would then begin to build up in the thyroid gland. This posed a significant risk to infants and children who were ingesting large amounts of milk and dairy in their diets. The fact that their thyroid gland is smaller and children tend to have a faster metabolism than adults means that the radiation levels increase more rapidly. The United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation conducted a research study that concluded more than 6,000 children and adolescents developed thyroid cancer as a direct result of the Chernobyl disaster. This has been disputed by some, but there is no denying the fact that young children were much more vulnerable to radiation due to their diet and physiology. On May 8th, containment crews drained the last of the radioactive water that was located under the core. Unfortunately, much of the contaminated water had already flooded parts of the complex and leaked into soil around the reactor. Altogether, the workers removed around 20,000 tons of radioactive liquid and buried it in an undisclosed location around the exclusion zone. Once this was completed, the engineers at Chernobyl could start building the containment structure that would finally contain the last of the radiation being discharged from the core. To do this, they poured concrete under the reactor to serve as a foundation of what would become known as the sarcophagus. Unfortunately, like many of the things that had led up to the Chernobyl disaster, corners were cut, and experts were either ignored or never consulted. Even after the sarcophagus was well underway, many nuclear scientists and engineers pointed out that the sarcophagus was structurally unsound, which turned out to be painfully true in the years to come. The containment structure would need to be repaired several different times, and eventually an entirely new structure would need to be built to encase the crumbling sarcophagus. While the concrete was being poured for the original structure, radioactive debris was continuously being buried at around 800 different locations in the area. Again, due to incompetence and gross negligence of the Soviet leadership, many of the sites were not recorded properly, and it's likely that contaminated material could be located in unknown spots all around Chernobyl. Of the 800,000 workers who struggled to contain the radiation and removed radioactive debris and built the sarcophagus around the reactor, approximately 300,000 received 120 millisieverts of radiation, which is about 12 rads. A millisievert is the maximum limit of radiation an average member of the public should receive in a year. At sea level, people receive around 0.27 millisieverts, while at higher altitudes, populations tend to receive closer to 0.5 millisieverts from background radiation. Therefore, these workers received 500 times the radiation they would have if they had not been at Chernobyl. To put this into perspective, a CT scan typically hits a patient with around 9 millisieverts. So the workers at Chernobyl received over 10 times as much radiation as a CT scan for the duration of the time they worked at the site. This greatly increased their risk of developing cancer and other radiation-induced illnesses. On May 14, 1986, Mikhail Gorbachev, then president of the Soviet Union, made a public announcement for the first time about the disaster at Chernobyl. This was likely due to the increasing pressure from the international community and the ability to keep the Chernobyl disaster quiet any longer. It's unclear when or if the Kremlin would have acknowledged what happened at the nuclear power plant if Sweden and the United States didn't have evidence that forced their hand. Gorbachev promised the people of the Soviet Union and the world that the worst was over, but his words were meaningless, as for many their problems had just begun. Most of the radiation was carried east or north by wind currents, leading to radioactive particles being blown into Belarus, Russia, and across Ukraine. However, as weather patterns shifted, some of the radiation released from the Chernobyl disaster made its way to western France and Italy. Millions and millions of acres of land were doused with radiation across Europe, including forests, farmlands, and water sources. Even though people around the power plant and in the exclusion zone had been evacuated, many others were still in danger of receiving at least some radiation, and depending on their bodies, it could be enough to make them seriously ill. In the years following the Chernobyl disaster, a significant percentage of livestock were found to be born deformed or with birth defects. One study discovered that around 33.5% of barn swallow chicks in the exclusion zone showed signs of abnormalities, while 17.8% of the adults showed signs of some sort of genetic alteration. The radiation from the disaster was affecting plants, animals, and humans. No one was safe from the radiation that had escaped from the exposed reactor. In late August 1986, the International Atomic Energy Agency held a conference where scientists and engineers examined the accident at Chernobyl and concluded it was the result of human error and a lack of adequate safety procedures. It was also found that there were several serious problems with the Soviets' reactor design that needed to be remedied if they hoped to avoid another catastrophe in the future. Hundreds of thousands of people needed to be relocated or protected from the initial fallout of Chernobyl. Subsequent studies concluded that the land immediately around the power plant would not be habitable for the next 20,000 years due to the high radioactivity in the area. However, this did not deter the Soviets from turning reactors 1, 2, and 3 back on. Even as cleanup efforts continued and the area around the power plant pulsed with radiation, workers and operators were sent back to the facility to ensure that the Soviet Union had the energy it needed. Many around the world could not believe the Soviets had turned on a system that only months before had a meltdown, but this is exactly what happened. Chernobyl continued to produce power for the next several years, even though another disaster could have been looming just over the horizon. Even after decades of study, it's still hard for scientists and doctors to measure the amount of damage the mistakes made at the Chernobyl power plant in 1986 have done. Most reports conclude that somewhere around 30 people died immediately after the explosion as a direct result of radiation exposure while combating fires, moving radioactive debris, or trying to get the blaze in the core under control. However, in the years following the initial disaster, as many as 4,000 people may have died from radiation-related cancers. Another 5,000 could still be at risk of developing similar illnesses, even though they may have received a lower dose of radiation. Millions of people in the former Soviet Union and around Europe also suffered both mental and physical trauma as a result of being evacuated and forced to flee their homes during the crisis. There's also the very real possibility that the disaster might play a role in genetic diseases or abnormalities found in future generations born to parents who were at or near Chernobyl when it was spewing radioactive particles into the atmosphere. Interestingly, after several years, the wildlife and plant population in the exclusion zone did begin to recover. Without further human encroachment or destruction of the natural habitat in the area, elk, roe deer, wild boars, lynx, birds, and other wildlife have returned, and their numbers continue to grow. In fact, scientists have estimated that there are around 7 times more wolves in the exclusion zone than in the surrounding reserves. That being said, there are elevated levels of cataracts, albinism, and other genetic defects present in these populations. Chernobyl and the exclusion zone serve as an interesting case study on how reduced human activity in an area can influence wildlife populations. Even plants and trees have begun to regrow in the region, and although they too show signs of genetic alterations from radiation, the ecosystem itself is thriving. It's unclear if unexpected problems will arise in the wildlife populations in the future due to generations of prolonged exposure to high levels of radiation, but as of right now, the exclusion zone ecosystem seems to be flourishing without a human presence to disrupt it. However, the USSR did not fare so well. The Chernobyl disaster took a huge economic and political toll on the Soviet Union. It also made the general public incredibly wary about using nuclear power or living anywhere near a nuclear power plant. The repairing of Chernobyl The containment effort and the relocation of over 100,000 people are estimated to have cost the Soviet Union around $235 billion. What is now Belarus, but was a part of the Soviet Union at the time, lost 20% of its agricultural land and approximately a quarter of its total territory to contamination. In 1991, Belarus spent around 22% of its annual budget on disaster response efforts to clean up and decontaminate the land affected by the Chernobyl disaster. That same year, Chernobyl Unit 2 was shut down after a fire broke out in the building. The reactor was unaffected, but the close call led to it being ultimately shut down and never turned back on. In 1996, reactor number 1 was also shut down. For the next 4 years, reactor number 3 continued to operate and produce electricity for the area. Then, on December 15, 2000, 14 years after the disaster that left much of the surrounding area covered in high levels of radiation, the final reactor at Chernobyl power plant was shut down, and the facility was officially decommissioned. In 2016, the new safe confinement structure was completed and then moved into position over the sarcophagus housing reactor number 4. Over the years, there had been several radiation leaks detected in the old structure, as it was never meant to contain the reactor indefinitely. The new safe confinement structure will keep the core of reactor number 4 contained for the foreseeable future. The structure that's in place today was the result of an international design competition, in which the French companies Vinci Construction Grands Projects and Bouygues Travaux Publics won a €432 million contract. Later, they would hire the Dutch company Mammoet to help with the movement of the new safe confinement structure into position over the reactor. Containment efforts and cleanup of the surrounding area of Ukraine are slated to continue until 2065. As of 2019, 11 RBMK reactors are still operational in Russia. It's not clear what precautions, if any, have been taken at these other nuclear power plants to ensure that the same type of catastrophe that happened at Chernobyl doesn't happen again. But since the Kremlin remains untrusting of outsiders, and the leadership doesn't seem to be nearly as concerned about public safety or the well-being of their people as they are about invading neighboring countries, there's a good chance that one of these nuclear power plants could suffer a meltdown in the future. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Ukraine gained control of Chernobyl and the land around it. In 2011, the Ukrainian government opened Chernobyl and the abandoned city of Pripyat to scientists and tour groups. Today, no one lives or is allowed into the exclusion zone without permission from the government. And since Ukraine is currently fighting a war against Russian invaders at the moment, no new permits are being given out. Terrifyingly, a battle did break out around Chernobyl, and many were concerned that the containment structure would be breached during the fighting. This is a perfect example of how Putin and his regime have very little regard for the safety or lives of their own soldiers. It's unclear what the future of Chernobyl will look like once the war is all over, but it seems that the Kremlin has no plans to improve its track record around public or nuclear safety anytime soon. Now watch, this is how you actually survive a nuclear attack, or check out what happens to nuclear waste.